In this video, we're going to be tackling Childe, aka Tartaglia, everything you need to know about the character, as well as the best ways to gear and utilize him in order to bring out the full potential of this very crazy and in-depth, unique damage dealing unit in Genshin Impact. So the first things first, obviously Childe is going to be very unique with his stance dances. This is what is going to determine whether or not you have the snuff to make use of this incredibly unique character. Childe has several unique properties unique to him, and this is going to be first and foremost the ability for him to stance change between a ranged version as well as a melee version. Each of these two different stances come with its own unique properties from the different Riptide debuffs as well as a different elemental burst. First and foremost, let's talk about the Riptide debuffs, as this is a core mechanic to Childe, and it's going to be what you are basing how you gear Childe around. So the first Riptide debuff is afflicted either by landing a critical hit thanks to his Ascension level 4, the Sword of Torrents, when Tartaglia is in Foul Legacy Raging Tide's melee stance, or if his normal or charge attacks do a critical hit, they will apply the Riptide status effect on the enemy. Afterwards, Riptide is going to be a debuff that is applied to your targets, which will cause them to suffer AoE hydro damage when attacked from Childe. Afterwards, though, you also are going to be able to do Riptide Slash, which is the unique property of his elemental skill, Raging Tide, his melee form. Hitting an opponent affected by Riptide with a melee attack unleashes a Riptide Slash that deals AoE hydro damage. Damage in this way is considered elemental skill damage and can only occur once every 0.5 seconds. His elemental burst, Havoc Obliteration, has two different forms. The melee form applies the ability of Riptide Blast. When the obliterating waters of his elemental burst hits an opponent affected by Riptide, it clears their Riptide status and triggers an AoE explosion that does hydro damage, and damage dealt this way from this trigger is considered elemental burst damage. So the thing to take away here is that Riptide Blast as well as Riptide Slash are considered elemental skill and elemental burst damage. This can be increased from the properties of certain weapons as well as certain artifact sets. In addition to Childe's unique Riptide mechanic, the other thing you are going to have to master when using Childe is the cooldown on his Foul Legacy Raging Tide elemental skill. This is because the stance that you stay in, the melee form, scales from 1 to 30 seconds, and you can choose to stay into this up to that 30 seconds, but the cooldown will scale right along with you. If you stay in the stance for the full 30-second duration, you are going to have a 36-second cooldown once you leave the stance. Basically, however long you decide to stay in that stance, add an extra 6 seconds to the time you stayed in it, and that is going to be the cooldown upon leaving said stance. There are ways to reduce this cooldown either through Constellations or through artifacts, and we'll be taking a look at that. Key stats for Childe as you are gearing him up include critical hit rate, critical hit damage, hydro damage, and attack percent. This means that you're going to want a critical hit damage circlet, a hydro damage goblet, and then attack percent on the final artifact. For substats, do attempt to get as much critical hit chance, critical hit damage, and attack percent as possible. These are the main stats you're looking for as you use Childe. Moving into weapons and weapon selection, if you do have the 5-star bow that is currently on banner, the Skyward Harp, this is going to be his best bow currently available to him. This is because the secondary stat on this bow is critical hit rate, and the bonus effect increases your critical hit damage. In addition to that, it is going to have a large amount of base attack, becoming a very strong factor in increasing your attack percent to allow your critical hit chance, critical hit damage, as well as your hydro damage to scale effectively. In addition to that, it does have a proc that allows additional AoE physical damage to proc as you are doing damage with Childe. Moving away from 5-star bows, though, we have 2 bows that are very powerful for Childe. The first one that we're going to be talking about is the bow Rust. Rust is going to increase your normal attack damage by a significant amount, from 40% all the way up to 80% damage, while reducing your aimed shot damage by up to 12% at max refinement. In addition to that, it also is going to allow you to increase your attack percent. This is a phenomenal bow if you're trying to do a very strong, hard-hitting main DPS Childe. You want his melee form damage attacks to just do as much damage as possible. Rust is a fantastic addition to your arsenal there. But there is another bow that we should and could talk about here, and that bow is going to be the Stringless bow. Now, the Stringless bow is very interesting, and this is going to be based around your Riptide procs, the Riptide Slash as well as the Riptide Blast. This is because, if you recall earlier in the video, elemental skill damage and elemental burst damage do affect these AoE effect hydro damage procs from the Riptide skill set that Childe does have. The Stringless also increases your elemental mastery, and to use this bow, you're going to want to set up a team around Childe. You are going to want to have a pyro character in your team to set up Vaporize. The best way to utilize this is to establish a team with an Anemo character, group all the characters up together, apply pyro on those enemies, and then swap into Childe and use his elemental burst to proc the ability on the Riptide for Riptide Blast plus the huge elemental burst damage. You're going to be double dipping on the elemental burst damage here, once for the actual elemental burst damage on the skill, and then on the Riptide Blast proc from his elemental burst. So the Stringless is going to offer a very strong burst damage version of Childe, and then in addition to that, afterwards, as you continuously proc those elemental burst and elemental skill affected Riptide Slash procs, those are going to be exploding for AoE damage, hitting all of your targets and allowing you to gain the advantage of the elemental skill damage on the Stringless. Now, I want to reiterate here, the Stringless is not going to increase the actual damage that you do with your melee form attacks. That is not what this is for. This is for the Riptide Slash and Riptide Blast proc. So keep that in mind when you're using the Stringless. You need to build a specific team around it, and it's strictly there for AoE damage, grouped up enemies, and it is shining the most in a vaporized team because it does have the elemental mastery, which is going to increase your vaporized damage even more so. TLDR, if you want a strong single target, no aim, no brain version of Childe, go for the Rust if you have that. If you want to do a more complicated AoE huge burst damage, continuous AoE damage with the vaporized procs, with the Riptide procs, then Stringless is going to be your go-to there in that circumstance. Moving into artifacts, there are some very strong sets that you can use for Childe right now for artifacts, but sadly there is currently no hydro damage artifacts. So let's talk about artifacts for Childe. There's going to be a unique go-to for 5-star sets, and there's going to be also a kind of interesting build that you can do with him to emulate a C6 Childe's playstyle. So let's talk about the first and foremost, the two shared two pieces. We have the Royal Flora set. This is going to be the Noblest Oblige set. The two-piece here is elemental burst damage is increased by 20%. This is going to not only increase the elemental burst damage that your elemental burst does do, but keep in mind it's also going to be able to affect the Riptide Blast proc when you use it with Childe. So this is going to affect both parts of his elemental burst in the melee form. Bonus damage there and bonus damage on the Riptide Blast. That is a significant part of his total damage. The other two-piece set that you can look to easily just slap onto Childe and make him do some work there is going to be the two-piece of the Gladiators Nostalgia set. This is going to be another 5-star maximum set, and the two-piece here is simply attack plus 18%. While it's not the greatest two-piece of all time, there really isn't anything crazy as far as other 5-star sets go to in order to increase the damage. You could go for the full 4-piece of the Royal Noblest Oblige set here, but this is going to only increase your attack by 20% for 12 seconds when you're swapping into Childe and using his elemental burst, so you might as well just keep the full uptime of the 18% for Childe himself. That being said, there is going to be a set out there that is going to be very enticing for a lot of you Childe players, and this is going to be the Gamblers set. The downside to this set being that it is currently only available as a 4-star maximum set, meaning that you are going to be missing out on a lot of extra stats simply due to the fact of how scat stale on 4-star artifacts to 5-star artifacts. The upside, though, is that the 2-piece and 4-piece bonus work very well with Childe. The 2-piece being elemental skill damage increased by 20%. This is going to increase the damage that your Riptide Slash procs do, and the 4-piece from the Gambler set is the set bonus that is going to allow you to emulate the playstyle of a Constellation 6 Childe. This is because defeating the enemy has a 100% chance to remove your elemental skill cooldown. This can only be occurred once every 15 seconds. So if you get a killing blow on one enemy once every 30 seconds, because you can maintain that cooldown on his elemental skill for a 30-second duration, you can instantly reset that full 36-second cooldown on Childe, which is what his elemental skill does with Constellation 6. That being said, if you guys are going after the Gambler sets, do know that you're going to have that reduced stat line, stat total, and if you are going for this set, you want to have the Circlet be your 5-star artifact and have it roll crit hit damage so you can gain the most amount of crit hit damage possible there. Also, the other downside of the Gambler set, in addition to obviously it being a 4-star maximum set with less total stat rolls, is the fact that you actually have to defeat something within that 30-second time window for Childe to actually benefit from this set. So if you're doing higher levels of the Abyss and you don't have the ability to do that yet because the enemies are increasingly tanky there, then you're not going to actually want to wear this set. That being said, 30 seconds is a long window to defeat something. If you have a proper team composition set up over that, then it could be very good for you. Speaking of constellations, what are Childe's constellations that we're going to be looking at? So the C1 is going to reduce the cooldown of his elemental skill by 20%. This is going to allow you increased uptime on his melee form. C2 is going to be Understream. If your opponents are defeated while you are affected by Riptide there, it's going to regenerate 4 elemental energy. This is a fantastic constellation. Bonus energy when defeating enemies, more elemental bursts, more elemental bursts affecting the Riptide elemental blast. Very high burst damage here with this constellation. C4 is going to be a also fantastic constellation for Childe. Basically, you're going to be double dipping on your Riptide AoE damage effects. This gives you bonus procs on Riptide. It's going to give you an additional Riptide when you trigger Riptide Slash. And then finally, Constellation 6, the one we are trying to emulate here. If you use your Elemental Burst while in melee form, your Elemental cooldown on your stance change melee form will be reset. So this is going to allow you 100% uptime on Childe's elemental skill Raging stance. So keep that in mind there. Fantastic constellation. If you want a full uptime on his melee stance, Constellation 6 is where you need to be, or you need to get the Gambler set and allow him to defeat enemies with that set equipped. Childe is a fantastic character with many unique properties that you need to learn how to master between Riptide as well as his stance dancing playstyle. He has a lot of variable playstyles for you to use him for, from straight up main damage dealer to elemental burst damage dealer. Whichever one you decide to use him on, we want to know about it. Leave it down in the comment section below if you want to see more Genshin Impact content and coverage. This is the place to be. Until then, guys, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.